Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are tuning in from around the world. We are so glad to have you join us here tonight for Stories and Myths, yet another episode of Stories and Myths.
Woo-hoo.
I'm here with the seafaring captain, John C. Farrell. So, John, you decided to go with a nautical theme this week.
Yes. My heart is with those people who are being affected by the hurricane.
Oh, that's what it was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's kind of
your authenticity comes through in a beautiful way. I want you to know.
I'm glad you appreciate that and have noticed that.
Yeah.
No, well, you're always stressing the C, so I was like, I don't want to just be boring and put a C, so I spelled it out for you.
I'm kind of like a pirate that way. I'm stressing the C.
All right, moving on. Yeah, you know that voice you just did? Yeah, let's not revisit that anymore.
You don't like my piratey voice?
No.
Well, it will come out when appropriate, but for now, we'll
it needs some work. It needs some work.
My piratey voice needs some work, matey. Arr.
It sounds like you just woke up after like a long slumber, and you have like a frog in your throat.
On my ship, the Red Pearl.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
did you ever get that piece fixed that I tried to help you with?
Has the black pearl. I have the red pearl.
Did you ever get that piece that I was trying to help you fix?
That piece
on top of your car?
Oh yes, I fixed it that afternoon. It took me all of 25 seconds, I think, to finish.
And it took me about 10 minutes to do just a little bit.
I have the piratey hands.
Yeah.
Long years of gathering the jewels.
It was really, really hot, and that's my.
Oh, okay, that must be it.
Yeah, that's my excuse.
What do we have on tap for this evening's episode of Stories and Myths?
Well, we are going to talk about JFK and what he meant to American history and all the his assassination and his involvement with the Vietnam War, as well as we're going to be talking a little bit about Watergate and some things that have happened since then. So that's
quite often on this program we've talked about the 19th century, and last week we talked about the 18th century. So I thought it would be good for us to come into the 20th century.
We're just a little behind the times.
It's a show about history, so
right.
You never know where we're going to land.
We're not talking about yesterday.
No, this is before either you or I were born. So
yes.
So what is our first question?
So the first question is it's about JFK. You say that he ran for president. If he ran for president today, he would be considered a conservative, and that is how much of the country has shifted to the left. I was wondering if you could explain that statement a little more.
Kennedy was a cold warrior. He believed in a strong defense of the United States. Kennedy believed he cut taxes. He believed in a strong space program, and he was very strong on free enterprise. So across the board, Kennedy had positions that are now considered conservative. Back then, he was considered a centrist or even a liberal to a certain degree, and by certain members of the country. But today, his positions are the positions of more conservative politicians, which shows how the country has moved politically far to the left since that time. I believe that part of the reason is connected to his assassination, which started a series of things in the country that broke down the trust of the American people in their own government. And we are now really far down that road to the point where there is distrust on both sides of the political spectrum. And it's a major, major problem. But Ronald Reagan, who was a Democrat, he was a huge fan of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Ronald Reagan
and
was a Democrat?
for most of his life.
Oh,
And what
I did
he
not know that.
said in the early 1960s, I don't remember exactly what year that he made the switch, but when people asked him, why did you switch from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party? He said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. And so today, and even during his presidency, people called Reagan a far-right conservative. But Reagan's policies were not very different from John F. Kennedy's policies, and they were only 20 years difference. That's what is hard to even grasp looking back in history, because it seems like Kennedy was so far before Reagan, but it was only 20 years. And if you count his assassination, it was only 17 years between Kennedy's assassination and Reagan's election. 17 and a half, but still, it's pretty remarkable. I take that back. No, exactly 17, because Kennedy was killed in November of 73 or 63, and Reagan was elected in November of 80. So yeah. 17 years exactly.
Well, talking a little bit more about JFK's assassination. So, what are your thoughts on that? Was it a conspiracy theory, or was there a lone gunman?
Well, let me ask you, what do you think? Because most people have an opinion.
Well, I honestly don't know what to think. I think, kind of like what we're discussing today, I think that there was someone who was definitely assisted in the shooting. I don't know if there was necessarily more than one gunman. I did read a fictional retelling of it by Don DeLillo called Libra, which actually, so my thoughts on it are kind of blurred with the fictional retelling that Don DeLillo wrote. It's a great novel. I read it in grad school, and so I'm trying to remember which of the facts are that and which of them is part of the Libra book. But I think if there was, I think there was at least more than one person involved. Whether there's more than one gunman, I don't know.
Okay, so my opinion.
So correct me.
What's that?
I said, so correct me.
Oh, no. I mean, no one knows for sure.
Right.
Based on, I've been to Dealey Plaza. I've been to the museum. I've seen the sniper's nest there in the book depository. I've stood on the X, which was pretty much, they're pretty sure that was the exact spot where Kennedy was killed. I have studied and read about the Kennedy assassination since I was in college, which was a few years ago now. And I am convinced that it was a conspiracy. I'm convinced that there were at least two gunmen. And there are reasons for that. And I want to give some of those reasons and not just say, well, this is my idea. So first of all, there was, it's pretty clear that there was a gunman from the back, and most likely it was Lee Harvey Oswald, because the first bullet went through Kennedy's back and came out his throat. And it hit Governor Connolly in front of him. And I'm sorry, the first bullet went through his throat. The second one went through his back and hit Governor Connolly. And that was considered what they call the magic bullet. But then the headshot, I cannot believe that the headshot was from the back. And the reason is that I have heard from almost, and you can watch these on YouTube, I've heard from almost every medical doctor that was in the emergency room at Parkland. And every single one of them said the same thing. They said that it was a fist-sized hole in the back of the head, and then down the side of the head, there was like a valley. And there's a problem with that, in that the autopsy photos don't match that. And so you have, who's telling the truth? Is it the all the medical doctors who all agreed and have no reason to lie?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it the government providing photographs who possibly have all kinds of reasons to lie? And there are a lot of things that don't make sense, don't add up, and look like conspiracy. For example, no one knows where the brain of John F. Kennedy is. No one knows. So why was the brain removed? Why were we not able to examine the brain? The other major thing, and there are many different other parts to this, but without going on too long, the other major thing that most people should question is, why did Jack Ruby murder Oswald? Because there was no way that Oswald would be able to testify or give evidence or lead the government investigators to any kind of conspiracy. Ruby was clearly connected to the mafia. He was a good old boy that used to kind of take care of the police in his very there was a lot of debauchery, let's say, that went on in Jack Ruby's club with dancers and prostitution and drugs and alcohol. And it was a very seedy place. Why was Jack Ruby allowed into that basement of the police station? I don't buy that they just didn't have as tight security back then. I don't buy that. This was the so-called murderer of the president of the United States. And they let this bar owner who owned a can club just to walk in. To me, I just don't buy that. It's just too convenient for this man connected with the mafia to shoot and kill Oswald on national TV live, to shut him up. The other big question that I have is when you look at the quote unquote magic bullet, which supposedly some investigator found on one of the gurneys, it is almost pristine. And yet it went through both Kennedy and Connolly. It hit Connolly's ribs, came out, went through his wrist bone, and then went down into his leg. Now they have reproduced that again and again and again, and never once have they been able to come up with a bullet that wasn't smashed to hell,
right?
With all kinds of bullet fragments all over the place,
right?
So I think I think that it was a conspiracy. I do believe that there were people very high up in the government who were involved. I personally believe that it was a combination of the CIA and the mafia, because the CIA used mafia in certain places, and whether it was Italian mafia or just organized crime, they would use the mafia to do hit jobs to keep themselves from being connected to these assassinations. And so this is something that we know. This is not conjecture. There's evidence for that. And so everything that I've heard and witnesses that I've heard say that Dealey Plaza is your classic triangulation that is used in an assassination. It was a perfect spot to bring at least 3 shooters together. So I believe that you probably had Oswald in the sniper's nest in the book depository. You probably had somebody behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll, because immediately, and there's video of this, immediately after the shooting, policemen and a whole crowd of people went running up that grassy knoll after something, after someone. Who are they going after? And those who believe the Warren Commission report say, oh, it was just echoes off of the buildings. But you had.
Could they have been running up the hill to get away from the shots?
Oh no, it was a police officer went up on his motorcycle, laid his motorcycle down, and then kept running up the This is all on YouTube. You can watch all these videos are on YouTube. And he went after somebody. And when they got up there, somebody flashed a badge and said, "We're with Secret Service." And the cop believed him and walked away. I think they were probably gunmen. There may very well have been someone on the overpass. And then again, there's a possibility that they could have been in one of the buildings, either directly behind or on the other side. But it was a perfect place to have multiple shooters. And so who knows how deep that conspiracy goes, but I do believe that it was a conspiracy. And I think that many people in our country since that time, lost faith in our government because they believe that the government lied, that the government killed the president, the elected president, and that the government has been covering it up ever since. But the problem is that in the 1970s, a select committee of Congress opened up an investigation on assassinations. And it didn't just include John F. Kennedy. It also included Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, I think possibly Malcolm X and some others from the 1960s. But their conclusion, based on a recording that came off of an open mic from one of the motorcycle officers, they had a sound expert examine that, and there were at least four and maybe five gunshots. Well, there's no mathematical way that Oswald could have gotten off more than three. So if there are four, then there is a conspiracy. Now, Mrs. Connolly, she said that she heard one gunshot, then a pause, then another, and another one right on top of it. Well, that's impossible if it was just Oswald. He could not have pumped and gotten a new bullet into the chamber in that amount of time and shot it off. So, her testimony was ignored. There were dozens of eyewitnesses in Dealey Plaza that were never interviewed by the Warren Commission. Now, anybody would, I have no axe to grind on this other than I want the truth. And I want to know that our government is not lying to us, that there wasn't a coup d'etat, with Lyndon Johnson waiting in the wings, like our friend said in the JFK movie.
Right.
I want to know that our elections have integrity and that our president isn't removed by our own government. And so why were those people who were eyewitnesses in Dealey Plaza, why did the commission ignore them? And there's no answer to that. And the arrogance that has been shown, not only by the people in the commission, but also the media. It's almost like the media wanted to cover it up. The media never really, I'm talking about the mainstream media, they never really did in-depth investigations. They kind of just swallowed the Warren Commission hook, line, and sinker. But just answer the question, why is there a fist-sized hole in the back of his head? One of the doctors...
That's not an entry wound. That's an exit wound.
That's an exit wound. Right. Yeah. You could not have an exit wound in the back of the head if it was a lone gunman up in the book depository. One of the doctors said that as he came into the room and was examining him, a large part of the brain fell out of that hole and onto the gurney. Well, if it's an entry wound, it's going to be this size. You can't have a large part of the brain fall out of an entry wound. So somebody, to me, is lying. Marlene Banks says, could be a lone gunman, but a conspiratorial act of more than just one man. So, well, that's the question, who knows? But to me, there's far more evidence of a conspiracy than there is of a single gunman.
Right. So, how did the assassination of JFK start the country on the course of tumult for almost 2 decades?
Well, I think it was a series of things. One, it's a shock It's a shock to lose a not only your elected president, but also someone in their 40s who has two little kids who are running around the president's knees, and everybody's in love with this family. And, John F. Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline, seem to be young and vibrant, especially after, you look at several presidents before them were all dowdy old men, FDR to Truman to what, Dwight Eisenhower. They were not exactly the jet set, any of them. And all of a sudden in comes this, 45 or however old he was, young man full of vim and vigor with a great sense of humor. He was one of our great communicators. And all of a sudden, like that, he's gone. And not only that, but many Americans were very grateful for the way that John Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they believed that he most likely kept America from getting into a war with the Soviet Union, which could have turned into a nuclear war, could have turned into a nuclear holocaust. And so, only a year later, this young man is gunned down in broad daylight in front of hundreds of people. And thanks to Zapruder, it was caught on the film. And so there's a pretty good, everyone pretty much has now seen this film, or most people have. And so it was a shock. And I think that really caused a major shift in the country. But then what happened is that while John F. Kennedy was a cold warrior, he also was a pragmatist. And he had fought in World War II, and he knew how ugly and awful war can be. And so he had allowed for military advisors from the American military to be on the ground and to be helping the South Vietnamese in their civil war against the North Viet Cong. The South Vietnamese were supposedly free. I mean, they believed in capitalism, whereas the North Vietnamese were Maoist communists who believed in communism. And so, this was in the middle of the Cold War, when there was the belief in the domino theory that one by one, these weaker, smaller countries would be taken over, first politically and then militarily, by the communists. And I mean, that's what they were doing. So it's not that it was a theory of what they were doing, but there was this theory of containment that began in Korea. And it actually worked in Korea, where we fought to a stalemate. I mean, we would have liked to have won the war. And I think that it had someone other than MacArthur been the general, we probably would have won that war. But MacArthur messed it up. So we fought to a stalemate that is still there today with the North Korean communist government and South Korean capitalist government. And I think, we're hoping to do the same in Vietnam. But what happened is that the South Vietnamese government was unbelievably corrupt. And not only corrupt, they were bloodthirsty, and they were not good people. And so there was torture that was going on. There were executions without trial that were going on. One of the famous videos is of a general, and they had just caught this North Vietnamese sniper, a guerrilla fighter, and no trial. They had just caught him. And the general walks up and with cameras rolling, and you can watch this on YouTube. It's not fun to watch, but you can watch it. He walks up in the broad daylight in the middle of the street, bam, shoots this guy and executes him with no trial or anything.
Wow.
John F. Kennedy was not pleased with how the South Vietnamese government was being run and with the corruption that was happening. And so he actually encouraged a coup. He thought that the people who would take on the coup would just kidnap and remove the president of South Korea or South Vietnam, but unfortunately, they killed him. And Kennedy was very upset about this. But Kennedy had signaled pretty strongly that he wanted to get out of Vietnam as soon as he could. And so there were a lot of people who believed that he was not going to send any more troops. Almost immediately after Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson started sending in troops. At first, more advisors, but then very quickly he started sending in ground troops, and then it was, escalation, and then they'd get hit by the North Vietnamese, and then there was an escalation, they get hit by the North Vietnamese, and it just kept accelerating and accelerating until it was a full-fledged American war, undeclared war, called a police action to contain communism, but on the ground it was a war.
Well, if Kennedy had stayed alive and had continued on being our president, do you think he would have escalated the Vietnam War like Johnson did?
No one knows for sure, but I don't believe, based on what he was communicating to his advisors and to the military, he was looking for an exit strategy. And now sometimes presidents get pulled into, into things that they don't want to be involved in. But he wanted to get out, and sadly, he was not able to, and we were not able to. So the Vietnam War escalated to the point where the military didn't have enough men to send over there, because after World War II, the U.S. military downsized dramatically. And so now Johnson wanted to increase the number of soldiers on the ground, but he didn't have enough, which then he turned to the Congress and they passed the Conscription Act. So they passed the draft. Well, just like it happened in the Civil War, during the Vietnam War, there were huge draft riots. And that caused a severe change in our society, where the combination of Kennedy's assassination and the possible cover-up, and then the government getting into an unpopular war where a lot of people were saying, why are we there? I understand wanting to contain communism, but why does my 18 or 19-year-old son need to be drafted and sent to fight in a war that we really don't have much skin in? And it was a hard sell for Johnson to say, well, we're trying to fight communism. A lot of people, mom and pops in America, did not want to send their sons for that purpose, especially in such a dangerous place, because Vietnam being very much covered in jungle, it was extremely dangerous warfare with all kinds of booby traps, all kinds of hidden tunnels where the Viet Cong would hide, and then they'd come out in a surprise attack and they'd mow down our soldiers, and then they'd go back into their tunnels and we never could find them. It was a very terrible
guerrilla warfare.
It was very much so.
Well, I want to read a comment that Marlene posted. She regarding the assassination of JFK. She said, "I remember that day like it was yesterday. I was in school and my teacher was called out of the classroom. She came back in crying. School dismissed early and we kids went home to our shocked parents and all the television coverage of our president's assassination. School was closed for a few days. Things were so solemn. The country was in shock and mourning. Even as a child, I felt a deep sorrow." I can imagine.
Yeah, and that, I think that reverberated. And then when you had the shock of this unpopular war, all of a sudden you started to have society was in a tumult. And there was a lot of distrust on all sides. And so by 1968, only 4 years after the Kennedy assassination, that was one of the worst years in American history. There were riots. There was a lot of racial tension. That was the year that Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed. And that was also the year in June that John Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy, was running for president. He had promised to de-escalate the war in Vietnam, to actually end the war in Vietnam. And in Los Angeles, he was shot and killed, which was another major shock to America. And so there was a lot of disillusionment. And so ironically, the person that had lost by only a few votes in 1960 to John F. Kennedy ran again in 1968, Richard Nixon. Now, the interesting thing is he had run for governor in California after he lost in the presidency, and he lost in that race for governor to Governor Brown, the father of the more recent Governor Brown. And after he lost that election, he said in a very bitter way to the press, he said, well, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. And he went back to his bunker wherever he lived in Whittier, California. And nobody heard from him for a few years, but he was pretty smart in that he could tell that the country was moving in such a direction that Johnson would probably, Johnson did win the election in 1964 against Barry Goldwater, but he was riding on the coattails of Kennedy's popularity and the sympathy vote for his assassination. By 1968, it was clear, and Johnson got on the air, television, said, I will not seek and I will not accept my party's nomination for presidency. Well, that opened the door for Vice President Hubert Humphrey and McGovern, or not McGovern. Now I can't think of his name. It's another M name. He surged early, but then he fell back in the polls. It'll come to me. But then also Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy got into the election actually quite late. And but when he won California, there were enough delegates there that it could be a race that could be decided in the convention. And the Kennedys were so popular at that point that Kennedy thought that he could have been elected or nominated because of that. But that night he was shot and killed, and so Vice President Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic nominee, and he lost to Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon came in saying that he was going to win the war in Vietnam, and he came in saying that he was going to fight communism. But then, interestingly, Nixon probably, Richard Nixon had some real great accomplishments. That's what, sadly, people forget about him. And one of his greatest accomplishments was that he met with Mao in China, and he reopened diplomatic relations between the United States and China. That was an important thing. You may have an enemy in communist China, but you still want to be keeping dialogue open with your enemies to keep it from escalating out of control. And so that was something that he did. But then his major mistake was our next question.
Right. So, yeah, as most people know, the thing that Nixon is known for mostly, and I know for me personally, this is the thing that immediately when you say Nixon, this is what pops to mind foremost. And I imagine that's with most people. So what is Watergate, and how did Watergate contribute to the shaking of the fabric of American society?
Well, the sad thing about Watergate is that it was totally unnecessary. Nixon was way ahead in the polls. And but he was, I believe that Richard Nixon had mental health issues. And he was a paranoid person. He was a deep introvert. And why he would run for president, the one office where you need to be a complete extrovert, is hard to understand, other than just a huge ego, but also a confidence. While Nixon was an introvert, he was very confident in his own skills. And so he was way ahead in the polls, and he was running against McGovern in
68.
in 72, and he was way ahead in the polls. And then there was a report that McGovern's vice presidential pick was having some mental health issues himself, and he ended up having to drop out of the race. And So there was no reason other than Nixon's paranoia to do what they did. But he hired these criminals, really. I mean, they were political criminals, and they broke in. I mean, talk about dumb. It was just dumb. They broke into the Watergate Hotel, which is still in Washington, D.C. You could go see it right down by the Potomac River. It's a very unique, really actually pretty cool modern designed building. I think it's a cool looking building, kind of Star Wars-ish. But
that's a little bit of a stretch, but yeah, I can see where you get that.
Yeah. So they broke into the Democratic National Headquarters offices and started going through the files to take information as if they, aren't going to notice this somehow. And of course, we know that it was Forrest Gump that was in the hotel and saw them, and he reported them to security.
One of the great many accomplishments and achievements of
it was like he was everywhere, all these important places, right? But so the security guards got wind that something was going on, and they went in and they arrested them. And at first, they said, "Oh, they're just a bunch of dumb burglars trying to steal things." But it became pretty clear just very quickly as they started to investigate who these people were and what their backgrounds were, that these were no petty thieves. These were political operatives. Well, while Nixon tried to cover it up and say, "Oh, isn't that awful? We cannot have this kind of thing happening in America, and they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law," all the while knowing that he was the one who ordered it. And we know that now because of the tapes. And then he confessed to Frost. If you ever saw the movie Frost Nixon, I actually have on VHS cassette the actual interviews between Frost and President Nixon. Yeah, because I'm nerdish. So, did you ever notice, by the way, these drawings behind me? They're Colonial Williamsburg. So,
I was just going to ask you what those were. Because
so that's the way I roll. There. I'm a history nerd, my friend. And so, what happened is that the White House tried to cover it up, tried to tamp it down, but certain journalists started to dig, and especially from the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, from which we got the book and the movie All the President's Men, starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, which is an absolutely excellent movie. But it was just, very deliberate journalism. And they were able to find an informant that had a very naughty name that we're not going to mention on the air, nickname that they used. But this informant would not tell them exactly, but he would answer yes or no questions. And so as they would dig, he would say yes. And they'd say, "Are we going in the right direction? No. Should we do this? Yes." And that was how they kept little by little pulling the information, not only out of this informant, but in their investigation, they would go to different people. And finally, what happened is that so much, it got to a tipping point where there was so much little pieces of evidence that it tipped and it freaked people out. And then they started looking for immunity. They started testifying. People were turning each other in. And pretty soon, they found out about this taping mechanism that Richard Nixon had in the White House. And the thing is that, Johnson had the same system. And I think Kennedy had the same system. But nobody knew about it back then. But someone testified somehow that Nixon had these tapes. Well, then it was fair game. And Congress said, "Well, we want to hear the tapes from this day when you talk to this person." And so Nixon, said, "No, it's executive privilege and there's national security involved here. You can't have them." It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "In regular circumstances, we would say yes, but because you are facing what could be, and we are facing what could be a constitutional crisis, then you need to turn these over." And so in the end, he did, but there were certain places that had been erased again, which, pointed to guilt. And then finally it came out that there was so much evidence that he had been involved, that he reached out to his friends in Congress to see if there was still enough to support to keep him from being impeached. And they finally said, no,
Wow.
you will be impeached. And knowing that means you will probably go into a criminal trial and you will be convicted. So Richard Nixon, in the midst of all this, ironically, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, who had been governor of Maryland, had been indicted for tax fraud. And he had left the vice presidency in disgrace. So Nixon, in the midst of Watergate, appointed, ironically, and we were talking about this earlier, he appointed Harrison Ford. Him from the movie Air Force One.
Air Force One, yeah.
So President Ford. He became President Ford. No, not Harrison Ford. Gerald Ford, the congressman from Michigan. And
Harrison Ford was from Indiana.
That's right, Indiana Jones. And ironically, Ford was a member of the Warren Commission. And so for me, Ford is a little bit of a slippery figure. He was a hardworking congressman. He did work his way up from the bottom, but he was pretty close to the assassination of Kennedy in his connection with the Warren Commission. And he was very close to Watergate becoming president. But what happened is that Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, which gave him immunity from prosecution for any crimes during Watergate. And so for the rest of his life, Nixon was free. And the American people, I think, said that we're not okay with that. There are many people who believe that it was politically, or as far as, bringing peace to the nation, it was a good thing. But as far as earning him his own term as president in his own right, the American people rejected that. And part of that was that you had a candidate in Jimmy Carter, James Earl Carter, who was the absolute antithesis of Richard Nixon. Nixon was very glamorous, even though he was awkward. Everything was very glamorous with limousines and all the best of the best. He used to hang out with the king of England, who had abdicated the throne. What I can't remember his name, but they called him David. Yeah, but you know who I'm talking about, with Wallace Simpson.
The King's Speech.
Yeah, his brother who abdicated the throne.
Yeah.
Nixon used to hang out with him, and they would have parties, and they were glamorous affairs. And Frank Sinatra would come in, and all these very glamorous things. Well, Jimmy Carter came in and said, let's get back to we the people. And in many ways, that was a good thing. But I think that Jimmy Carter took it too far. And at that time, it's interesting because my friend Daniel Wilbur wrote in here, whip inflation now, which was the button that the Ford campaigners wore, WIN. And he remembers my debate in fifth grade where I represented Jimmy Carter in the debate. And
that cracks me up.
He'll write in and say, I remember that day. Anyway, Ford, there was high inflation. This was when OPEC was cutting crude production to I got to show the whole audience here. He said, you were great. Actually, I got some things wrong and was berated by the teacher, but I did my best for a fifth grader. So
Daniel, please don't inflate his ego any more than it already is.
Well, anyway, inflation was going out of control. The oil prices were going out of control. We had lost the Vietnam War. There was that awful, terrible scene of our Marines leaving from the rooftop of the American embassy and people trying to cram into the helicopter so that they wouldn't be killed by the communists. It was, they were pushing, they were pushing the helicopters off of the ships because there wasn't enough room on the ships to take all the people and the helicopters and all the other things that they were trying to get out of Vietnam. It was terribly embarrassing for America, and it was a terribly difficult time. And now Ford pardons Nixon, and people were like, enough. And so Carter came in into this, a really difficult time. And while I have respect for him as a person, I actually think that Carter was one of the worst presidents that we've ever had. He was not a visionary leader. He did have a great accomplishment with the Camp David Accords in bringing peace between Israel and Egypt. But there were not many more accomplishments than that. And part of the big problem with Carter, and we talked about this earlier, was unlike people like John F. Kennedy or Ronald Reagan or later Bill Clinton, these were people of vision. Bill Clinton's his campaign song was "Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow," and that goes all the way back to FDR. Ronald Reagan learned it from FDR. He said, FDR, in the darkest days of the Depression, in the darkest days of World War II, he kept saying, happy days are here again. And he kept saying, we are going to mobilize. We are going to win. We're going to protect freedom. We're going to protect democracy in the world. So he projected American strength. He projected American vision. He projected something that brought about unity. Where Jimmy Carter, he said, things are bad and we don't think that they're going to really get better. And so rather than, moving ahead, we all need to, just cut corners. That was Jimmy Carter's answer, was that everybody needed to turn down the thermostat rather than saying, let's gather the best and the brightest and let's solve the problems and say, America's best days are ahead because we are a free people. And when you are a free a people, then you are given the ability to think and to create and to think outside the box. And that is what Jimmy Carter couldn't grasp. And that's one of the reasons why he lost to Ronald Reagan, whose campaign slogan was that it's morning in America again. After 20 years from the assassination, or 17 years, from the assassination of John F. Kennedy through the horrors of Vietnam and the social upheavals of, all of the junk that happened in the 1960s and in the early 1970s, and then through the terrible betrayal of the American people in Watergate, because, no matter what you thought about Nixon as a president, when he tried to usurp the American people's vote by putting his thumb on the scales of the election, that's just as much a coup as an assassination when it comes right down to it. So it was absolutely immoral. It was illegal. It was wrong. And sadly, Nixon will go down throughout history as someone who broke the trust of the people and would have deserved everything that came to him had it not been for Ford. So after all of that, after then the oil embargoes with OPEC, after the terrible inflation, imagine there were banks that were charging 20 and 21% for home loans. Home loans today are down to 2 and 3 and 4%. They were charging. Can you imagine? No wonder the economy had ground to a halt. And the other thing was these huge taxes that the Democrats had passed in the 60s and through the 70s. And you have to blame Nixon for some of that because he didn't cut those taxes. But Ronald Reagan came in and said, right now, government is our biggest problem, and we need to cut these taxes. And he did. And it opened up an economy that through the 1980s was an unbelievable roaring economy. Now, I disagree with some of the things that Reagan did. I disagree with some of the things that other Republican presidents have done, especially our massive military spending. It's been out of control, and I know for a fact that there's unbelievable waste that happens in our military industrial complex. And none other than General and President Dwight D. Eisenhower, on his way out of the White House, he said, this is the big danger that we're facing, and that is the military-industrial complex. And that's something that sadly Reagan didn't control, and other presidents have not controlled. And so we have to find a way to be able to have a strong military while also keeping the costs at a more reasonable place.
So, okay, I have one last question. Before we get to those questions, I'll read a couple comments that have come in recently. Marlene said, "Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning," which I believe was his campaign slogan, right?
No, that's a scripture.
Oh.
But he had the campaign. Reagan had the campaign slogan that is similar to this thought,
Okay.
and that was that it was morning in America again, saying there is hope. If we come together, we can overcome these problems. And he led America out of the malaise of the 1970s, and the 1980s were truly a remarkable decade. And people on all sides of the spectrum, if they're honest.
Your audio just went out.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. I didn't catch the last bit of what you said.
People on all sides of the spectrum, if they're honest politically, would agree that Reagan's leadership led us into a dramatic decade, and really more than a decade. It was, probably up to towards 20 years. There were a couple of dips in there, the recession during George H. Walker Bush's presidency, which helped lead to Clinton coming into office. But then Clinton had an amazing time as well. So it really wasn't until 9/11 that that started to slow down.
Mm-hmm. All right. And the last comment we got from Daniel Wilbur saying Reagan had been learning campaigning skills for many years, working for GE as a spokesman.
Yeah, that's right. And the interesting thing about that is that they did not tell Reagan what he could or couldn't say. Reagan had been the host of a television show called the GE Story Hour or something like that, where they did these dramas every week on television. And, by this point, Reagan's film career had pretty much dried up. Well, television gave him a new lease on life. It paid well, and he only had to do these small little 10-minute segments, and he got paid like he was in the movies. But part of that was that General Electric, which was the sponsor of this television show, then asked him to promote the TV show by going to all the GE plants around the country. And then when he did that, he'd have other engagements at like the Chamber of Commerce in these different cities. And so Reagan, they said, say whatever you want. So he started developing his political views and testing them in these speeches. And that happened over the course of more than 10 years. And it got to the point where Reagan became, he was already a great communicator. He was an actor, and he was a trained actor. And, if you ever saw the Bonzo movies, he was a good actor. No, there are a couple movies where he's actually quite good. And one is called Where's the Rest of Me, where he plays a young man whose legs are amputated. And then also, of course, his greatest role, which was the Knute Rockne story, where he played the Gipper.
Gipper, yeah.
Yeah. And that was what he was best known for, and, was called the Gipper for the rest of his life. Absolutely. So, by the time he was ready to run for political office, running for governor in California, he was ready to go.
Awesome. Well, we just have a couple more minutes, so I'll leave you with this one last question. Senator Ted Kennedy challenged President Jimmy Carter and lost in the Democratic primary of 1980, and then Carter lost to Ronald Reagan in November of that year for the presidency. And so, how do you see this as a turning point for the country?
Well, I think that there was a great tragedy there, because the Kennedys were, they have a lot of great qualities. And especially I was a very big fan, and still am a big fan of both John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. Now, we all know now of personality things and some bad behavior that was going on behind the scenes, especially with regard to John Kennedy and his adulterous affairs. And that's a tragedy. But politically, he was a pretty excellent president. He did not have a lot of time to develop that. And who knows what would have happened, in a second term. The same thing with Abraham Lincoln. You can only judge by what they were able to do. But Kennedy was able to do a lot. And then his brother, Bobby, really picked up the torch of his fallen brother and carried that forward. And God only knows what might have happened in America had Bobby Kennedy become president, because I think he was a fair-minded man, and he could have brought a lot of stability in the country that wasn't there. But then, after he was killed, Teddy Kennedy really had a crisis in his life, and it's totally understandable. His two brothers, who he looked up to and he loved, were brutally murdered in public. And all of that weight of the expectation, combined with his own personal grief, caused, I think, him to have a bit of a meltdown. Ted Kennedy was a very smart person. Increasingly, he moved with the country to the left, to the point where there were many things that I did not agree with and did not like about his policies. So he, was the one Kennedy that politically I didn't agree with, but I had to respect him as a great politician. They called him the Lion of the Senate because he had been in the Senate since he was a very young man. And so in his later years, he had unbelievable power and influence. But sadly, I don't think he always used it for the best of the country, in my opinion. The other major tragedy was that in his grief, Kennedy really moved strongly into drinking. And there was a party off of the Massachusetts coast on a small island called Chappaquiddick. And Kennedy was there with a lot of his political friends, and there were a lot of women there who had been people who had volunteered for the Robert Kennedy candidacy, and also, for Teddy Kennedy's different elections. And they were having a good time. Who knows what exactly happened? All we know is that a lot of drinking was taking place. And Ted Kennedy invited, or was asked to give a ride to this young lady to take her home. And on the way, we don't know all the details, but we know that he was driving, that they went off the road, off of a bridge into the bay, and he escaped, and this young lady did not, and drowned. That was the moment that Ted Kennedy lost the presidency. Because had he not done that, there's a high likelihood, because the Kennedys were tremendously popular, that either in 72, 76, or 80, or who knows when, he would have been elected as president. But for him to have lost to Jimmy Carter, who really was not the greatest president, showed that the American public said, we like the Kennedy family, but we cannot allow, just like they said to Richard Nixon, we cannot allow someone who has done something like this to be elected president. And so it was a tragedy in that. But then it also was something where the American people, I think, said, we want to put the 60s and 70s behind us, and we want it to be a new morning in America. And they elected an optimist and a visionary who turned out to be, in my opinion, one of our great presidents. And I think historians looking back will look at his accomplishments and say they were really, truly great. That includes the cutting of the taxes. That includes strong defense, although I think that his spending was a little too high. But it also includes the winning of the Cold War. And I believe that you have a combination of Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul, and Ronald Reagan, and all three of them great leaders, bringing tremendous pressure on communism and that was where it cracked, and that was where it broke, and that's where it fell in Eastern Europe, it fell in the Soviet Union, and it was dramatically changed in China. Even though it's still a communist nation, it's not a Maoist or a Soviet type system anymore, although lately they've been moving back in that scary direction. So we need to pray that that wouldn't happen. So the good news is that Ronald Reagan, I think, set a precedence and set an example that I hope that presidents continue to follow for years and decades to come.
Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Do you have any last statements?
No, we want to thank once again everyone who's joined us tonight and remind you that we're here every weekday on Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern U.S. time for Stories and Myths. And if you have a question, please feel free during the show to put it into the chat room. We're able to bring these comments up onto the screen now. Excuse me, so
nice
everyone can see that. Yeah, it's a nice little new function that we have. But also, if not, and you'd like us to consider something for an upcoming program, please send us an email. You could do that by going to my website, vonbuseck.com. It's very easy. Look down here at my last name, VONBUSECK, without the space, vonbuseck.com. Follow the bouncing fingernail, right? And vonbuseck.com, and send in your question. We'll be happy to consider those for a future program. And you see behind me 3 of my books. Over here is Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. And this is Nobody Knows, the Harry T. Burley story. And this is Forward, the Leadership Principles of U.S. Grant. If you are interested in any of those books, you can get them on Amazon or by going to vonbuseck.com, or you could go to victorbook.com grantvictorbook.com or grantforwardbook.com or wherever books are sold. And if they don't have these books in your local bookstore, ask them to put them in. I'm also going to ask for one more favor for those who are watching. YouTube has a strange rule where you have to have over 100 followers in order to let your URL have your name in it. So right now, my YouTube channel is just a bunch of gobbledygook that is just doesn't mean anything. So I need to get to 100 viewers or 100 subscribers at my YouTube channel. So if you would, just go to YouTube and put in my name, Craig Von Buseck, and then please subscribe to my YouTube channel so that we can change that name. It's just easier then for people to find it. So for John, the man of the sea, arg, Farrell.
Again, I said, don't do that.
Hey, you put a nautical term in there, and I'm going to go all piratey on you.
All right, all right.
John, the sea, arg,
I won't do that again.
Farrell. I'm Craig Von Buseck. We will see you next week. Same.
I will be here next week, though. So.
Oh, where are you going to be next week, John? Farrell.
I will be at my youngest son's vacation Bible school performing.
So
I don't know what I'm performing.
You're going to be a pirate, of course. Yeah, matey. You got to get a parrot for your shoulder.
Actually, the theme is trains, so I'll probably most likely be a train conductor.
You'll be John Casey Farrell. Casey the train man.
Right.
All right. So for John C. the Sea Farrell, I'm Craig Von Buseck. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.